can see, the session on regenerative at scale. Thank you for joining us. We have a fantastic panel. It's going to be quite an informal conversation, first amongst ourselves up at the front here, and then we would welcome any questions or comments from you. Now, I'm going to see if, okay, there's a lot of other things happening up here. Oh, there we go. Okay, theoretically, I shouldn't have to do anything else after that. We'll see if it changes. That's just in case you get, tired of looking at the panel, which I can't imagine you would, but we'll give you some background as well. So, kick off with some introductions. I'm Kathryn Firth. I'm a director at Arup in cities planning and design. I'm an architect and urban designer.
My name is Rudi Scheuermann, and I'm a fellow at Arup from the Berlin office, and my hobby horse is multidisciplinary design and the impact of envelopes upon the urban realm. And we would like to introduce our panelists, and I would like to start with Dina, who is an architect and a Passivhaus specialist at Haworth, Tompkins. I hope I say that correctly. And she is the one who is responsible for the strategy for sustainability in this practice.
And I'm going to introduce Carolyn Steele. Carolyn's an academic and writer, but her big focus is really food and cities and the relationship between those, and that's something that we're really keen to have a conversation about today. She's written a couple of books that have won awards. I'm sure many of you have heard of them: Hungry City, How Food Shapes Our Lives, and then more recently, Citopia, How Food Can Save the World, which, with a title like that, you have to admit that's why she's here. So very much sort of looking at the role of food and what she calls food place. And that is then something that we see across, well, hopefully it's something where we can engage in with government, but also academia and industry and the arts. She's a visiting lecturer at Cambridge, London Met, Wageningen, Aarhus, and Slow Food universities, and at the LSE, which is where we first knew of each other. So with that, I'll hand it back to Rudi.
And our next person on the panel that I want to introduce is Jacob Loftus. And Jacob used to be the head of resolution property in the UK before he founded his own company, which is General Projects. And I'm sure we will hear more about that during the discussion.
And then last but not least, Marie-Claude Gervais. Marie-Claude is a qualitative research strategist and diversity and inclusion expert. She generates evidence and insights into the experience and needs of people to understand how they might benefit both individuals and organizations and society at large. She works with government bodies, but also many names or organizations you'd recognize: Channel 4, Estée Lauder, Care Quality Commission, Jaguar, Macmillan Cancer, so quite a broad range. She held the post of lecturer in social and organizational psychology at the LSE for 7 years before joining the commercial sector, where she thought she could have a bigger impact. So that's an interesting thing to put out there, and it's probably true. So with that, we're going to just sort of, as I said, keep it quite informal, kick off with some questions, and then with these very diverse perspectives that we have here, generate what we hope will be an interesting conversation.
So Kathryn, regeneration at scale, what does that mean for us? I mean, that's a question that we have asked ourselves. Is scale meant in terms of geography? Is scale meant in one action? What does scale mean? And we would like to hear your opinion about that.
And before we turn to each of you, I think what one of the things that we're keen to discuss is if we want to make ultimately what we think is necessary, big change, right? Like I think everybody would agree there's a bit of a crisis right now. So we want to make big change. Does big change mean we can only make big moves? Or is it that, you know, saying that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole? What should our approach be? And perhaps it's not as black and white in that, and it's either or. So I don't know if anybody wants to immediately jump in, or we can select you. Carolyn.
Always happy to jump in,
Yeah,
as you've probably already noticed. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and it's lovely to be in this panel, which I'm looking forward to very much. I mean, I think what interests me about food as a medium is that it spans scales. And actually, I mean, I was an architect in a former life, and you know, for me, the question of how we can affect change at different scales has always been something very interesting, and how we perceive scales and live at scale. And I think what I love about food, and I haven't got any drawings here today, and I've only got one hand because I've got a mic in the other, but for me, the power of food is that in a bowl of soup or something is the universe. And I've done drawings that show this, because basically food is obviously of nature, and of course we are of nature, and we live on a spinning planet, kind of, you know, whirring through space and revolving, which gives us seasons and day and night and so on. But also, you know, the sort of, I think now our sort of increased understanding of the microcosmic world also tells us that, you know, the sort of, you know, this thing about every atom you eat's basically kind of been eaten by 7 other people before you eat it, you know, it really does remind us we're part of a living, dynamic, constant system, basically. But of course, food spans scales very effortlessly. But the other extraordinary thing that it does, and what I write about in both the books you kindly mentioned, is that it shapes our lives in profound ways, some of which we're extremely aware of. I mean, you know, I kind of been sort of slightly too Labradorian in my diet recently, you know, but in others, you know, the fact that it's shaped our cities, it shapes our landscape, it shapes our climate, it shapes our economy, it shapes our politics. Why does this do this? Because we have to eat. And the question of how to eat is our oldest shared problem. And it's directly related to the question of how to live. And over, you know, thousands of years, as we've evolved, better and worse ways of eating, and lots to say about that, but if we have time. But, you know, the way we live has evolved too. So, for example, we didn't live in cities, big scale, until we started farming, for example, and we didn't have a huge population explosion until we started farming chemically with fossil fuels, all of which is now, of course, coming back to bite us. So the last thing I would say is that food is the most valuable thing in our lives, but we've evolved as a society and based an idea of a good life on the idea that food can be cheap. And it can't be cheap, because food consists of living things that we kill so we can live. So to cheapen food is to cheapen life. So it is a pars pro toto, as you said in your introduction, of asking all the big questions. How do we share? How do we balance our lives with nature? How do we balance our lives with one another?
I have to come in there. That also means the way we produce food actually has a big impact on our environment, on the way cities are being developed, the way people live with each other.
Yeah.
So that begs the question, and I'd be curious to hear from the other panelists, how deliberate do we need to be about this? Because, yeah, we all sit down for that bowl of soup or salad that has, you know, a huge story behind it, how it got there, where it was grown. And what you describe almost feels a bit more like a natural evolution. But is this a moment across, you know, all of our worlds, all of our disciplines, that we have to be more deliberate in making people aware of what those systems are?
Yeah. I think strictly linked to what Kathryn was saying is how we designed our cities. How do we design a building? How do we try and move on from a merely sustainable approach, which is let's minimize the harm, to net positive, let's regenerate, let's create something that actually is producing something more. And that means basically embedding our kind of human activities within nature easily. So we can actually have this relationship with food, even though we're basically starting to live in denser and denser cities, or encroaching more and more into kind of green space, and how do we do that? Basically, that's a way of kind of changing the way we deal with the entire system, the entire kind of the way we design, the way we think about the infrastructure, and we've actually tried to, at Howard Tompkins, we tried to move a bit into the direction of regenerative design just by thinking, can we implement something that's a bit wider? It's not just energy, it's also biodiversity, it's also kind of all the energy flows on a site, from orientation, green space, and what happens there. You need to assess everything, not just focus on kind of little elements here and there. And there was this incredible saying by Donella Meadows about kind of systems thinking and how you basically create a change in a system. It's basically telling a new story, create a new narrative, rather than try and deal with the existing system and change the metrics here and there. So probably that's something that deals with how, as humans, we interact.
So Jacob,
do you want to?
sorry, I just wanted to say, Jacob, when you develop projects, are you thinking about sustainability and how that involves the people?
Yeah, definitely. I think for us as a real estate development company, 99% of the projects we do are about taking existing buildings that probably most people might look at and say, let's demolish them, and work out strategies for how we can adaptively reuse the buildings. I think one of the built environment is the biggest emitter of carbon across any industry on the planet. And typically, if you knock a building down and build a new one in its place, even if the new one is the most sustainable building, which is net carbon zero and uses all the new technology around sustainable development, it still probably takes 30 to 70 years before all the carbon emitted in the development of that building has been kind of amortized and reduced. So, for us, coming back to your original question about is it big moves or little ones, we as a business really try and focus on both. So at the big level, we're big advocates in our industry that no one should be knocking down buildings unless there is a phenomenally good reason to, because that in itself is a kind of a big move to save carbon and take the sustainable route. But I think what we try and grapple with a lot as a business, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts around it, is there's the big picture play around saving buildings and reusing them, but how do we create the moments, and in particular the opportunities for individuals to selectively be able to control their carbon footprint for them to make a sustainable decision? I think most people in today's world, if given the option to recycle if it's easy, or to take a more sustainable route, or to do the right thing, people want to do that if it's easy for them. And I think systems aren't currently designed to enable people to make those individual choices at source. And I think that's, to me, a really important thing.
I'm going to ask Marie-Claude to come in on that, because I think that's really, from some perspectives, I feel like, can we only get anywhere through regulation? Because not every developer, for example, is general projects. And as you say, we're all companies are made up of individuals.
I think it's interesting. It's all an interesting conversation. From my experience of trying to change behaviors, as a social psychologist, that's a lot of what I try to do. There's a bit of a myth that the way to change behaviors is to raise awareness, to increase knowledge, that this is somehow going to change attitudes, and that the mix of raising awareness, imparting new knowledge, changing attitudes is going to result in the right behavior. And this is potentially true in some cases, and there is no doubt that there is this massive consciousness, conscientization around the need to protect our planet. We have only one. We might decide to go to Mars, but for most people that's not practical or even desirable. But if what we're trying to change is behaviors, there's a shortcut to changing behaviors, because this is such an indirect causal change, and so many ways, you can misfire in so many different ways, and there's such energy loss in trying to change all these antecedent behaviors, or awareness, knowledge, attitudes. If what you want to change is behavior, let's create the choice architecture that's going to make behaviors, the most desirable behaviors, the easiest to pursue, and you're absolutely right. Let's kind of remove the barriers, make it easy, create the right choice architecture so that people can do more of what they want to do. But it's hard for ordinary people, as it were, to create that choice architecture because they don't have the means to do that, the resources, the know-how often. So it's balancing, as you said, and finding when there's the most desirable points for input, in what way, and in the meantime removing barriers and creating a better choice architecture, I would say.
I think this gets back to something Carolyn, I'm not sure if you said it today or in a previous conversation where you said we have to maybe redefine what the good life is, what a good life. Like we are kind of, we have a sense of, this is what I need in life, this is what I'm entitled to in life even. But how do we make that redefinition? Which I guess, and I'd love to hear from everybody, gets back to how do we each define regenerative or regeneration? What does that really mean?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely my question. I'm using food as a lens to ask the question, what is a good life? So I've sneaked into that, the area where you're meant to wear sort of white flowing robes and have a beard and so on, called philosophy, by mistake, by the back door. But actually, we all have to do this, because we can't get where we need to get unless we're all asking this question. And I think we've forgotten to ask it. And I think one of we were just saying in our huddle before we, came under the spotlight, capitalism is failing. Capitalism is a sort of an idea of how to get to a good life that was invented 250 years ago. So it's not surprising that some of the conditions, that gave its basis originally don't exist anymore. Number one, Adam Smith he kind of conceived what we now call trickle down. We know, does that shorthand make sense? Do you know what I'm talking about? If you make more efficient factories, the owners will get more rich, but that'll be fine because they'll just invest in more factories and it'll be good for everyone, basically. We know that doesn't happen. They just siphon the money off and stick it in a tax haven. So that's thing one. There's only trickle up, there isn't trickle down. Thing two is the assumption that nature is infinite and comes for free, which is a reasonable thing to kind of imagine in 1750, because it was very difficult to imagine we kind of run out of world. And so, capitalism treats nature as if it's infinite and comes for free. This is a complete disaster. So we're in this kind of bizarre... And the third thing is, the idea that you do a job and are productive and get wealthy, and that wealth is, the sort of the ultimate goal, which is obviously, again, glorious new government seems to still believe this incredibly in the face of, vast information to the contrary. So money has come to represent the good. Now, one interesting thing that I think happened under lockdown is that either by denying us things or giving us things unexpectedly, we discover what we really need for a good life. And this is really, really simple stuff. Well, simple's a wrong word. It's fundamental stuff. It's closeness to each other. That's the biggest thing I think all of us suffered with under lockdown, just being around people we love. Closeness to nature. So many people said, I just discovered my local park. I used to be too busy rushing to the office to kind of smell the spring coming up kind of thing. 3, kind of community. That was very, very strong. It always is under a crisis, by the way. 4, meaning. And of course, so many people volunteer to help, the NHS and stuff. We're all standing outside our doors clapping. People do care about this stuff, but it's obscured by the capitalist system. And it's something meaningful to do, obviously, not just abstract meaning, like looking at a painting, but actually doing something. And 5, time. Capitalism destroys time. Because Benjamin Franklin said, time is money. Time is not money. Time is life. And of course, COVID, gave us time back in ways we didn't expect. So, and I could go on, but I think the mistake that we have made is to think that by following this mechanistic industrialist sort of a paradigm where you work hard, you get rich, and you're rewarded by buying handbags, it's just not what we need to be rich and fulfilled. It's all rubbish, and it's an outmoded system. And what we actually need is, and this is where it becomes a design problem, access to nature, strong communities, meaningful work, a stable government state that allows us to sort of have access to health, transport, and so on. It's really, really simple stuff, but it's not what the hidden paradigm ideology is driving towards.
Carolyn, how do we capture some of these recognitions? Because during the pandemic, I've seen a lot of people who would probably have agreed. Now that we're at least feeling that we're coming out of the pandemic, which remains to be seen, but now that we're feeling we're coming out of it, I suddenly see old patterns kicking in. All of a sudden, you know, it is the car again, it is again the sort of status symbol of whatever, you mentioned it, you know, the handbag, whatever. All of a sudden, I feel that people fall back into old patterns. How can we rescue some of these recognitions to actually go into this big regenerative phase, which we inevitably have to face?
I mean, I can answer that, but I'm talking a lot. So, I mean, if anyone else would like to come in, I mean, I'll come back to it later, but yeah.
I think in terms of design and cities, I think this is something we need to address. The fact that we want our cities to be denser, but then we need these spaces that we discovered in the pandemic that are so important. Spaces to breathe, spaces to play, spaces to meet. And this takes an area, and we want to make sure that whenever we have a building on a site, that means that basically regenerative would mean that the biodiversity of that site is actually enhanced. Everything that happens on that site is way better than before, and that is our challenge as designers. And I saw Michael Pollan in the audience now, who wrote the book on this. And I think this is a challenge in terms of design and architecture, and there's probably a challenge in terms of behavior and how we deal with that.
So for me, it's less the challenge in terms of behaviors, but I think the problem is, like in every aspect of life, whether it's health inequalities or, I mean, political inclusion, digital inclusion, the second you start creating a wonderful regenerated and regenerative environment, what happens is people want to live there. The property prices go up, and so actually the market kicks in, and then you have this situation where you've improved one place, but you've also, in the process, created wider inequalities. And the problem with inequalities is that it's counter to the principle of regeneration, because actually a regenerative city is one where there's greater fairness, equity, access to resources, better health for all, not just for some. And I would have to disagree with you that I'm not so anti-capitalist as you are, because I think that we need the capital invested in cities. We just then need to find a better way of redistributing that capital.
I'm just
for the wider
against
benefit.
a particular kind of capitalism.
Yes, but I think that, I guess the simple point is, in any walk of life, you can't generate improvements and think, right, hey, I've done something better. The second you create an improvement, you create with it a widening of inequalities. So you have to always pay very specific attention to the more vulnerable, to the people likely to be excluded.
I think it's interesting listening to this from the, wearing the property development hat and just thinking about, real estate is such a huge component of the city and one of the fundamental drivers behind everything we're talking about. When I think about kind of the regulations that we have to go through to either develop a building or renovate one, sustainability and kind of urban greening and all of those good things are a hugely important component of the process now. But you sort of feel like they're done from the people we're negotiating with on the other side from the city, and actually even us, neither party really understands what's the kind of really positive derivative outcome of this. It's very much, okay, there's certain criteria you've got to meet, but actually for everyone walking around the city and experiencing it or living there, none of those things that months of negotiation between the developer and the city go back and forth to hopefully deliver all this great stuff, which is so important, actually doesn't filter down in a way that anyone can interact with it. And something that I read a few months ago was that the mayor of Paris has mandated that on top of every single building that gets built in Paris or renovated in Paris now, the entire roof has to be green. Question mark over exactly what plants what they're planting, but I don't know what proportion of the footprint of London is buildings, but there's hundreds of square miles of rooftop across the whole of the city that in theory could be publicly accessible with the right technology, could be growing food perhaps, could certainly be contributing to biodiversity, could certainly be providing access to more green environments for people. But, you know, no one seems to talk about that stuff, and it's like we're busy worrying about a cycle lane, you know, as opposed to looking for the bigger solutions that can really be evolved to so many people.
I would want to come back to one thing that Marie-Claude said with regard to what you're doing. If the problem is that property prices go up, if a place is nice, people want it, how do you resist as a property developer to drive that spiral? Because, you know, it is, you're doing this job to make money. And if you're doing that, how do you resist the fact that you're only developing for the rich? I mean, how do you actually take the others along? That's very important too, isn't it?
I mean, property development happens across London, across the UK, at very different price points. So, you know, I think in every location there'll be a dynamic around, you know, is this development going to make an area a little bit more expensive? But I think, to me, that's in a way less of the question. For me, the bigger question is, how do you make sure that all of that capital that goes into the real estate sector to build new buildings or refurbish old ones, how do you make sure that that money is being utilized as best as possible to, you know, create the most sustainable building, to deliver urban greening, sustainable farming, whatever it might be, to ensure that all areas are kind of benefiting?
I mean, it was a bit more directed towards the fact, how do we take those people along who actually don't benefit from lots of money, those who are less privileged, because if we're not getting sort of a better balance between privileged and less privileged people in our society, then we will have a serious issue, won't we?
Carolyn.
Could I come in? I sort of one of the fascinating things about the Garden City is that it's completely not what everybody thinks it was, and it was actually a proposal for radical incremental land reform. And one of Howard's, Ebenezer Howard, who came up with the Garden City, one of his big inspirations was an American economist called Henry George. And Henry George wrote about exactly what you're talking about. He wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, and he wrote it when he was living in San Francisco, and he watched all the railroads getting built coming out west, and people getting ludicrously rich by virtue of just happening to own land near the railway. And he thought, this is wrong. They haven't done anything, and they got rich because they own a particular pot of land. And so he came up with this idea of what he called a land value tax, which, and I'd be interested to know what Jacob thinks of this as a property developer, but basically, and it also refers, I think, to one of your, the thing that we were sort of, as it were, by implication, discussing, Marie-Claude, about capitalism. I'm not against markets, I'm just against unregulated, exploitative markets, which appears to be increasing what we have. But anyway, I like the idea of a land value tax, because basically most of the wealth in the world resides in land, and as Mark Twain famously may have said, by land, they're not making it anymore. You know, so I think increasingly land, well, nobody can find the attribution, but it's the kind of thing he would have said. And it's a great quote. You know, so basically, the question of, if we're talking partly about, well, we're talking, of course, about everything, but, you know, about how you create a good society, how we share, you know, resources on a shrinking planet. And my thing, which is that everybody needs access to land to live a good life and lead a good low-carbon life, critically, we need land reform. And one way of doing it is through a land value tax. And how it works, very briefly, is that the idea is that all land is owned by the community. If you want sole use of it, you pay a rent to the community for basically sole use of the land. As the value goes up, you pay more rent. You know, and it's really simple. And George reckoned, I mean, actually, this is, by the way, a policy of the Green Party. They've only got one MP, which tells you everything you need to know. But, you know, I think it's really critical that we do something like this. It has the effect of flattening land values and therefore making land more available. And it also has the interesting effect of making cities more dense and farmland more affordable. And, you know, one of the regenerative things that's really big if you're in food world like I am is bringing city and country closer together and creating a sort of a productive region, if you like. And it's a really big potential part of that.
Marie-Claude is someone who lives in a garden suburb.
Yes, I have a great privilege here. I live in a garden suburb, and it is, I find it endlessly fascinating, actually, because it really was designed to bring different people together. So there was, housing for the widows of the Crimean War, with children, like orphanages, as small housing for workers. And of course, it's green and it's lush, and nobody is allowed to have a wooden fence. You can only have ever a green fence, a hedge between people. So the sense of the space being shared, everybody has to have a garden that's bigger than their property because it's nice and healthy. So loads of things that make it almost revolutionary. Really a fantastic model. The density is not quite high enough to be sustainable, and the truth of it is we're going to have to increase density to house the world's population, and we need to house people in cities because cities are much more capable of being sustainable, really, because rural environments are, houses have more heat, kind of escaping heat. There are people rely on the car infinitely more. So you need that density of people coming together in cities, but you also need to create enough kind of multiple centers of interest in cities in order for people to live. And that's what I think COVID taught us, actually. The local environment needs to be rich with green space and with workplaces and places to shop, and so people to be able to walk or cycle from one place to another.
15-minute
right?
city.
The 15-minute city
is not a new
really...
idea, by the way.
Sorry?
Yeah. It's not a new idea.
No.
No.
But it made it very real during the pandemic, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be interested, Diana, and I'm sure Jacob, you have something, as you were already touching upon this. Do we feel like there is, I feel like as a practitioner, that there is a bit of a gap between the sort of very, high and lofty ideas that come from the right place around sustainability, resilience, and what regenerative really needs to be, and what we then as practitioners are up against when we're trying to do projects that are doing the right thing.
And talking to developers and basically trying to see if that's actually something that they would be on board with. And I think that comes with what the market is asking for. What are all of us asking for? And that can start with, it's basically, I think, it's just peer pressure. It's starting with a girl going on a strike on a Friday, and then having, by the way, this Friday there's a climate strike in London, please be there and join. Because when you have lots of people saying we want this, then that gets into the right places and makes this change happen. And developers have started to have lots of goals and environmental kind of responsibility brought into their policies and so on. It's still very difficult to get that into action, into, yes, these are our targets, but how do you see those targets actually implemented in a design process and see that into a built product? I think that's the challenge that we have as designers.
But is that because of cost? Because we all know, as Jacob said, that to take a building down and start over is often cheaper than just working with what's there? Or is that because regulation doesn't keep up with what the community wants?
Probably both, and probably would they be more interested if they knew that actually a low energy, highly efficient building would be more desirable on the market, and they would actually get more money for something that's really, really super insulated, airtight, energy efficient, generates energy and so on. Would we pay something extra for something like that as a client, as somebody buying a house or a flat or something like that? Because then that puts the pressure on to them to deliver that. It's a question of...
I think there's two really interesting themes that we've kind of watched happen over the last few years, and I'm going to pick up right where you left off. Would someone pay more for something that's better? I think, hold that thought, but in the kind of institutional investment world of real estate, we've sort of watched over the last 3 or 4 years this kind of term ESG, where everyone's suddenly really concerned about environmental, social responsibility. And it's really interesting watching kind of our peers and other people in the industry kind of suddenly have jumped onto that and realized that actually if they want to be raising new funds and if they want investors or banks to be lending them money, their projects have to be sustainable. And as a consequence of that, everyone's kind of greenwashing all these buildings with all these big statistics around, the building's so low carbon this and da 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 da. And in a way, part of that is a good thing because the market has sort of begun to create this paradigm shift with the private sector around the importance of environmental responsibility. The problem is where that shift and jump has gone to is, oh yeah, these brand new super sustainable buildings, which actually, you know, one day they might operate really sustainably, but someone's got to build them first. And I think the problem is the end customer doesn't understand what good looks like, so they can't yet demand it of the people building it, and as a consequence, people building aren't building quite the right stuff. And I think trying to educate people as to what is good in an environmental standpoint, or in a kind of urban design or a healthy city or a greening factor, these are complicated buildings. These are complicated processes. It's very difficult to know what's really green and what's not, you know, and it's really easy for people to kind of stick up the signs and, you know, get the paintbrush out to say it is, but trying to figure out how you are in an articulate way, but also in a kind of quantifiable and almost regulated way, understand what that is, what is good, I think is the really, really important thing. I think once people know it, they'll demand it and the market will respond.
Well, energy cost, for one, that will be a big driver. And how much will it cost for me to, you know, live in this flat, in this house?
I mean, what we would like to do, we would like to hear your comments and whether you have questions or suggestions of what generative design might actually touch you and how we would possibly sort of implement it in a big scale. So if anybody has any comments, I'm happy to give you the microphone. Are there any questions? Any suggestions?
Maybe if you put the lights up, because it's all a bit sort of dark and gloomy, people might feel a bit snoozy. And we feel more, sorry, to be stage directing.
Have any of you got an idea how we can take everybody along to support such a movement? Yeah.
Hi, Gregory Epps from Fast Forward Rewind. I'm a strategy consultancy. And so I think just to pick up on Jacob's last point about actually understanding more the sort of statistics behind some of these suggestions that we're having about what we should do, it's a very important first step. So I found it quite interesting over the last couple of months, you know, things we're talking about here, like putting solar on buildings, obviously seems like a great idea. And suddenly it became apparent to me that people were publishing statistics on the energy costs and material requirements for solar compared to nuclear, where nuclear is much lower. So the amount of energy you can get from the cost of just the cost to build these things, the material, the land footprint, is so much lower for nuclear that we've all kind of grown up understanding that nuclear is a terrible source of energy because of the danger, the inherent risk behind, you know, spent fuel rods and things like that. So I think we all have a sort of duty to ourselves to be very carefully looking at what's really happening from a sort of physics standpoint, and make decisions based on that. I mean, you might have something to comment about the current state of energy in Germany.
Well, being German, I probably wouldn't agree with you because nuclear energy has sort of the benefit of privatizing the benefit but socializing the later cost. They are not built into the electricity price of nuclear, while if you get your photovoltaic on your roof, you pay all the cost. And if you would put all the cost of nuclear into the price, then it would be much, much higher.
We could extend that.
Yeah. But yeah, this is not a discussion about energy.
Nuclear or the solar, I think the general theme is like we need to be very carefully looking at our assumptions when we make.
No, I absolutely agree, and not everything that appeared apparent, and that's what Jacob basically has said. You know, not everything that we've always thought is green is necessarily green, and not everything that we always thought would be the best way is necessarily turning out to be really sensible. And the question is, how do we get people to be coming along and to support the right movement?
Thank you. I'm Tobias from Arup, and one of the ideas that almost everyone has sort of skirted around is the idea of imagination. Like Jacob mentioned, people not really knowing what good is. Carolyn, you mentioned sort of not being able to imagine past the capitalist framework, and Donna Haraway famously said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And you know, you mentioned the Garden City, which is a product of a time when imagination was rife in what we could do and what we could design, and that was sort of partly blinded by ignorance and people not really maybe thinking through the consequences. So I'm wondering, as a panel of practitioners and thinkers, where you see the space in the process before you even get to a building or a plan for people to really experiment and play and imagine and actually put out the wild ideas that maybe move us into a better world, that aren't just sort of restricted by targets or ESGs or constraints or things like that.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that there is such a space, to be honest. I'm not entirely sure. I think the Localism Act tried to do a little bit of that with neighborhood planning and putting the ball into the hands of communities, deciding for themselves what are their priorities. But then it's not the most imaginative of solutions, because you have to have 51% of the local people who back you up. And so 51%, usually when it gets to a majority, you've kind of killed a little bit the wild ideas, right? But in principle, the idea of getting the change to come to be driven by needs on the ground and people who felt what the needs were, the unmet needs were, and wanted to drive that was one kind of, I think, productive way forward. But if you wanted to create a whole neighborhood plan, which might be operationalized over 8 years, you had a maximum budget of £7,000. So split that over, 4 years or 5 years. It's really, really hard to get it off the ground. But the logic behind it was the right one.
I think we need some forum. I really agree. And I was very interested. I couldn't go in the end, because I got ill, but I was invited to speak to Citizens Assembly in Brighton, and and by all accounts, from the people organising, this was an extraordinarily interesting experiment. The nearest I've come to it, by the way, is jury service, which I think, I don't know how many of you done jury service. It's the nearest thing I've come to in my life of genuinely feeling like a citizen, because you are given a really, really serious task, a difficult task, to decide whether somebody's guilty or not of a crime they've been accused of and whether they're going to go to prison or not. And what happens is you get around a room with 12 people you've never met before in your life, some, highly intelligent, some maybe not quite keeping up with all the, you're a proper cross-section of people, and you have to sit in there until you come up with a discussion. And the discussion that came out of both times I'd done jury service was extraordinary. I think we need something like that for politics. I think we need a kind of duty. By the way, the Athenians did this. I know sort of, Marie-Claude will probably be able to give us chapter and verse on the ancients. But, in ancient Greece, 40 citizens were plucked from the population and required to discuss matters of the city and come up with ideas. And I think that's completely brilliant. And we just need more participation in our politics. And as I said earlier on, it astonishes me. Friends of mine, when I told them about this crazy book I was writing called How Food Can Save the World, they said, well, you can't do that. You're not a philosopher. And I said, well, actually, I seem to be already doing it. So just being a human and caring about... Sorry, I know I go on a lot. That's what I think.
Great stuff. No, we need to keep that. I just like to get the questions. Sorry. Because we're running out of time.
Juliette Morgan, I'm with Gensler. I think there's an opportunity here around teaching permaculture. That this is a conversation from a position of privilege in a country that hasn't yet had to deal with the extremes of climate change. And the extremes of climate change will require a lot more people than just the design industry to have adaptive responses. A generation of children are not being taught sustainability. Whole societies don't have permaculture education. I think there's an education component to this.
Great, thank you. Anybody else a comment?
Permaculture is a really, really interesting approach philosophy, by the way. I really agree. For the first time, I actually read the book, because we skip through, permaculture, yeah. I actually read it. It's incredible. Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, 1970, right on the money. Dealing with everything we need to be dealing with. It's incredible.
picking up on what Carolyn was saying there, I think it's a slightly alarming reality that we've actually had a lot of the solutions we need for 50 years. You know, we had ecological economics by Herman Daly. Walter Stahl outlined the circular economy 40 years ago. We've known how to do zero carbon buildings for 30 years. And so now there's a really urgent question, I think, about how do we bring about these shifts? And I'd love to hear from the panel on what you think the really sort of big levers are that we ought to be pulling. What are the sort of systems change level levers that we could be bringing into action?
That's a perfect way to allow you to sum up, because we're very aware of the time. So thank you for that. We planted Michael there to do that. Yeah, so do you each want to take a shot?
I think something actually prompted by a previous question. Research and innovation. I would say it's the way to go, and we need to have that in every architecture practice, engineers practice, and to have that little time, money, and actually find research funding and ways of actually sponsoring all this activity, because it's super crucial for us to go forward.
Whilst I'm a capitalist by nature, I'm also very much a believer that the free market has to be policed, because without regulation and oversight, people will act in their best interest with very short-termist thinking. So I'm a big advocate that we should have a carbon tax, particularly around the construction industry and new developments, which in a way also does have an impugned rebasing of land price as well.
I'm going to cop out here and say I think it's such a big problem that it needs to be tackled at so many different levels, and they're all really important. But the key issues, I think, are about transparency and accountability in relation to each one of them, so that when people are not doing what they're saying that they're doing and they're greenwashing X, Y, or Z, we have a way of holding people to account. But good luck to us.
Well, good luck to us, definitely. Thank you very much for that question, Michael. And, I think, for me, actually, in my book, I propose internalising the true cost of food, interestingly, because, as I said at the beginning, food is life. And part of the problem we have in our society is that we don't value the right things. Again, I think that's something that we saw under lockdown, clapping nurses. There's a brilliant cartoon going around of a nurse at a checkout saying, "Ooh, I don't seem to have any money. Do you take applause?" We don't value the things that really matter to us, and we've got to sort this out. And for me, the easiest low-hanging fruit, is to pay the true cost for food, because actually, for example, industrially produced meat would immediately become totally unaffordable, which it already is. But also, everything that matters in our life actually is filtered through food. So that's a sort of an idea that I'm putting forward of a new kind of economy. Doesn't get rid of markets, but it does require a lot of also state intervention. Well, we'll have to take it outside.
Yeah.
Well, I think, that's a very
Obviously,
good sort of range of answers to your question. And I think we actually will all have to give our best to support that. And I would like to add that symposiums like this are very, very important in actually to have these discussions, because your feedback is very important, I think, for all the practices and for the people who actually want to make this change happen. Therefore, involving everybody who has something to say about that is very, very important. So please speak up in future, because it's important that your voice is being heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marie-Claude.